Okay.
Delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Calypso, for your kind words. Thank you for the invitation. It's a double act during this short visit to Oxford. And of course, it is a very great pleasure to come back to my old college. I had my first teaching appointment at St. Anthony's, so it's a great pleasure to be back. The title of this evening's talk is Crisis in Greece and Southern Europe, a whodunnit. So presumably I'll be looking for the villain or the villains in a drama that has been unfolding for several years and with no happy end in sight as yet. And perhaps let me start with a few points of clarification as to how I'm going to go about it and then move into the subject. The comparative figures I will use to illustrate my point will cover the whole of the European South, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, plus Ireland as an honorary member of Mediterranean Europe, although more successful than most. That's number one. Number two, Cyprus will not be included because Cyprus joined the afflicted group more recently, and there is not enough evidence to deal with. So I will concentrate on the 4+1. And many of my comments will concentrate on Greece, with comments also about the other countries, but more on Greece, for a number of obvious and less obvious reasons. One is that, as they say in Brussels, this is the country I know best, although I'm not always sure. Number two is, I have to admit, I did not have enough time to reflect on what I should say about the other countries before coming to the seminar. So this is a confession. And number three is because Greece has been not only a catalyst in the beginning in the transformation of an international financial crisis into a systemic crisis of the euro area, but has often been seen as leading the way, and some people suspect maybe leading the way to hell. At least this is the suspicion or the fear that other countries in the periphery have, or even in countries. I find it always interesting that when I go to France, there's always much greater understanding for the plight of the South, and especially Greece, in France than in many other countries. And it's not so much a question, I think, of solidarity for the European South, but also the deep suspicion that if things go wrong, France can be on the wrong side of the fence itself. So, now, two also, not so much points of clarification, but preliminary remarks. The first is that you will probably agree with me that the crisis we've been going through, starting point 2008, is the worst economic crisis that Europe has experienced since the end of the Second World War. It is a crisis that is going to have profound effects, not only political and social, in the countries concerned, but it is also likely to shape, in a way that we not yet know for sure, shape the European integration project. That's number one. Number two is that it may be useful sometimes to think of the crisis as a set of Russian dolls. You know, Russian dolls, you take one, you open it, you find a smaller one inside, and so on. The problem with this particular set of Russian dolls is that one is uglier than the other, number one. And number two is that there are three sets, and let me explain what I mean by that. And this crisis is, first of all, as we all know, an international dimension, all right? Because what we're going through is the consequence of the bursting of the biggest international financial bubble since 1929. This is not a European problem, it is not a Greek problem, it is an international one. Or to be more precise, it is a problem of the Western financial system, because the crisis did not affect directly either Russia or China or India or Brazil. It was the problem of the Western financial system. And it is the result of huge market and institutional failures. And I will not dwell upon that because I suppose this is not our main topic today. The second dimension is the European one, because we soon discovered, or people realized, that there is also a systemic problem of the euro area, a systemic problem that essentially results from the way Maastricht was constructed, or if you want to put it differently, in the words of the late Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, it is a currency without a state, or some kind of state. And that is a contradiction in terms. And the systemic crisis is the result largely of that contradiction and the unpreparedness of Europeans, or rather the decision of Europeans to have a common currency, but without the instruments and the institutions necessary to make it viable in the long run. One irreverent expression I've used sometimes is that I think that the Europeans, with the euro, the way they constructed the euro, they wanted to repeat the Immaculate Conception. And the Immaculate Conception may work in some religions, it doesn't work in economics. And the third dimension is the national one, because the crisis has revealed all kinds of national failures. Individual country problems, where you have increasingly unsustainable economic and social models that are becoming increasingly unsustainable in a globalizing environment, economic world, and also countries with increasingly dysfunctional political systems, and all that came to the limelight much more because of the crisis. Now, my talk, I will start with the period before the crisis, and then the second part would be what happened when the crisis struck, and end up with very few comments, prospects about the future, economic and political. I will situate all that in the context of the euro area. So I'll be talking about the periphery, Southern Europe, as part of the euro area. Remember that the euro was set up in 1999, and I think it is important to stress that the euro was not the first attempt at European monetary integration. There had been at least two major attempts at European monetary integration before. There was one in the 1970s, when the Europeans decided to create a complete economic and monetary union by 1980. I suppose if it had happened, you would have noticed. It failed, and there was another attempt with the European monetary system that was set up in 1979. Now, the lesson we can draw from those two attempts, or rather, the first thing that you can observe immediately is that in both cases, the system became very quickly German-led, and a few years later, a system with shrinking membership, as one after the other countries that could not follow the German lead or the German standard of reference had to abandon the system. And I personally am convinced, and I said that also yesterday, that Germany has a structural advantage in a system of European fixed exchange rates. And it has to do with the kind of economic policies, with the tradition, with the corporatist tradition, with consensual politics, and so on and so forth. When we created Maastricht, I think there was an implicit assumption that one of two things was going to happen. Either the Germans would adjust their policy priorities and therefore try to meet their partners halfway, therefore not repeat the experience of the earlier period, or that the other countries would be like Germany. Right? Because the euro operated on the assumption that there would be a convergence of economic performances and a convergence of economic policies as a precondition for a convergence of economic performances. Of course, experience suggests that neither of those two things happened. The others did not become like Germany, and Germany did not adjust. Instead, what happened was that, especially since Germany started in the early years of Euro membership as the so-called sick man of Europe, Germany set a standard in terms of wage and price increases that in the burst of circumstances other countries would find very difficult to follow. And many of them did not even try. Because remember that the European South, Greece, but also Italy, Portugal, Spain, had for the first time access to so much cheap credit. They could borrow for certain parts of that period, even at negative interest rates. So what happened was that Germany set a very demanding standard, and others had a party, thinking that membership of the euro provided access to free money, essentially, cheap money. And let me illustrate what I mean by that, and then we'll see the consequences. This graph shows the divergence in inflation rates between 1999 and 2013. Germany is the red line, and, well, the others you'll see. Basically, what does this tell you? That until 2009, the German inflation rate was significantly lower every year than the inflation rate of the sinners. Right? They are the 5 sinners there of the European periphery, which means that the divergence becomes cumulative year after year. Right? If you go to the next graph, it's even worse. Take divergence in unit labor costs. Now, the Germans managed for some time to have an even negative change in unit labor costs, while the others, look, for example, at Greece in 2003, I think, the Greeks were clearly having a party. Wages were going up, while the Germans were almost deflating. Okay? If you accumulate that, you will see the result in current account balances in a minute. So next graph. The divergence in inflation rates and unit labor costs is largely reflected in current account imbalances. See what happened there? I've added Netherlands because this is the country that traditionally runs very large surpluses in the European Union, but nobody pays much attention to the Dutch because they keep a low profile and also because they're much smaller than the Germans. So they do not have such a systemic effect on the rest. So look what has been going on. You start in 1999 with even Germany running a current account deficit. Okay? And then only the Dutch have a pretty substantial current account surplus. And then you go on and you end up with Germany and the Netherlands running current account surpluses between 6 and 10% of GDP per annum. While the party members, those who are having a party, are running huge imbalances, huge deficits in their current account. The Greeks are bad, they are the worst of the lot in 2007 and 2008, but they are a bit worse than the others, but the others are not doing that badly either. Okay? People thought that those current account imbalances could be sustainable in the long run because of capital movements. So basically what was happening, I simplify of course, is that German banks, not only, were recycling the money. So much of the savings of the Germans was recycled via German banks in the form of loans to the sinners who were enjoying themselves. And we thought that this could last forever, because it's interesting that until short time before the outbreak of the crisis, there were not that many economies who pointed to the problem. Not many. And then crisis comes. But let me go through some of more graphs. And this is a summary really of the economic situation. Now, is the party reflected in large current budget deficits? It is true of Greece, and as you can see in this graph, I mean, the Greeks joined the Eurozone. They they went through a period of fiscal consolidation in order to be able to meet the convergence criteria and be admitted, probably with a bit of creative accounting, but there was a bit of creative accounting even in other countries. The Greeks were probably a bit worse at that time, but not much. And then the moment they joined, they thought that conditions no longer applied. So they relaxed their fiscal policy and started running deficits that kept on growing and reached the level of 15% of GDP in 2009. While, the Germans were very virtuous, as they always are, but the interesting point to make is that neither Ireland nor Spain were sinners in fiscal terms. They were doing even better than the Germans. So the Irish and the Spanish problem was not the result of fiscal laxity. The problem in Greece was largely the result of fiscal laxity, but not that of Ireland and Spain. And this is also reflected in the next graph, which tells you that is the accumulated deficits over years, all right? So Greece enters, when the crisis strikes, Greece's debt is already significantly above 100% of GDP. So, by the way, is Italy's. While poor Spain and Ireland have done extremely well. I mean, they've cut down their budget, their debt enormously. They are much better than Germany or most other European countries. So to say that the crisis in the European periphery is the result of a long period of fiscal laxity is, if I may say so, bullshit. Because it applies to Greece, but it does not apply to several other countries. Yet, this became the established truth after the crisis struck. It became the established truth that the crisis is largely due to budget deficits, and therefore you need fiscal austerity to deal with the problem. And then two more graphs. One is, how were they doing in terms of growth and unemployment? Well, the Greeks were running large budget deficits. The Irish and the Spaniards did not, but they had some others. They had another problem. They were going through a bubble construction boom, and with very large increase in bank lending. So all those countries were running at rates of growth which were significantly higher than that of the reference country, which is Germany. So Germany was virtuous. It was not spending money. It didn't have a high rate of inflation. It didn't have a high rate or increase of unit labor costs. It didn't have a big deficit, but it was also growing at a very slow pace, while the periphery was doing very well. The exception here is Italy, because remember that the Italian economy has been languishing for a very long time, much before the crisis. So the Italian problem goes further back. And Portugal. And Portugal as well, you're absolutely right. And my last graph for this part of the presentation is unemployment. Again, I mean, unemployment, the picture is not so clear because, but still you see that a large part of the periphery was not doing that badly in terms of unemployment in relative terms until the crisis struck. So, conclusion I draw is that instead of either Germany adjusting or the others becoming like Germany, Germany continued on the old established course, and even more so, in an attempt to deal with the problem of the German economy in following reunification, while the periphery, having access to cheap credit, made the best use of it but by inflating and keeping standards of living higher than would have been otherwise. The one term that one could use to apply to those countries is that the term that, what's the name, Mr. Wolfgang Streeck, who wrote a very good book on borrowed time. So those countries were living on borrowed time and money. So, and then the day of judgment comes. The day of judgment comes a bit later than the bursting of the bubble, and Greece becomes the catalyst for the transformation of the international financial crisis into a crisis of the euro area. I will spare you the details, I'm sure many of you know them, but just remember that Greece has elections in 2009. The outgoing government, faced with a weak government, faced with the prospect of losing power, took the foot off the fiscal brakes. They had produced a budget plan for 2009 of representing 3% deficit of 3% of GDP, and they ended up with 15% of GDP. So they decided, you know, it's like if you're going to lose the election, you might as well go to hell, send the whole thing to hell, and expect your successor to deal with it. Or you give him a bomb that's going to explode. So the responsibility of the previous government, which was the center-right government of New Democracy, is clearly enormous, but the responsibility of the socialists of PASOK who took over is not much smaller, because they won the election with the promise of spending even more money on welfare. They should have known better. And then they took long time to react, having announced to the bewildered public, including European fellow leaders and to markets, that the Greek deficit was going to be more than 15% of GDP in 2009. So suddenly markets, that of course financial markets, if I may put it bluntly, at least that's the way I see it, have nothing to do with efficient markets that one reads in some economics textbooks. Because if they were efficient and rational actors and had capacity to predict, they should have realized that the thing was unsustainable not only for Greece but also for other countries. But they woke up suddenly when the Greek government announced the figures, and then they zoomed on Greece. And they realized that the whole thing was not sustainable. And the result was that Greece very rapidly lost access to markets. So it could not finance its deficit. And it could not refinance its old debt. And then the epidemic, it became an epidemic, spread very fast to other countries. Now, who is responsible? When I talked about responsibility, there's no point in going further with New Democracy and PASOK. The problem with Greece was, Greece in fact had the worst combination of three deficits at the time when the crisis struck, and that's why the markets concentrated on Greece. It had the biggest budget deficit of all, as a percentage of GDP. Plus, it had the biggest public debt as a percentage of GDP. It had the biggest current account deficit, which had reached in 2008 14% of GDP. And it had a credibility deficit as well, because suddenly people realized there was something called Greek statistics. Okay? So, you know, if you want to be polite and diplomatic, you say that all people engage in some creative accounting, but the Greeks really overdid it. This is a polite way of putting it. So that explains why the markets concentrated on Greece first, but then very quickly began to realize that there was a problem with Ireland. But the problem with Ireland not because of its fiscal deficit or its debt, but because of its banks. So the problem in Ireland was banks, the problem in Spain was banks. The problem in Portugal is somewhere in between, really. But you know better, and I hope you will inform us more in the discussion. What was the reaction of Greece's and the periphery's European partners? the first reaction was shock and horror. The second was denial. First you say that this can't be true, and then second you say, well, it's only the problem of Greece. So Greece is a unique case, therefore refusing to recognize that apart from a Greek problem, which indeed there is a Greek problem, there was a Greek problem, there was also a systemic problem. And so denial meant that you refused to recognize the systemic nature of the problem. Having gone even beyond denial, then there was a third reaction, and that was the punishing mood. You punish the sinners. And yesterday I said also that in all this debate, especially in the early years after the crisis struck, economics has been very much caught up with morality, because you have also to bear in mind that in German as well as in other languages, debt and guilt are exactly the same word. So if you have debt and you are guilty, that morality comes into the picture in the political discussion. And then after the punishing mood, the next step was buy time, hoping that things will improve, or that you will try to strengthen your institutions to deal with clearly a huge, it was the mother of crisis. Trying to develop a European economic strategy, the creditors clearly dictated the terms. Not only for financial assistance to debtors, but also the terms for the whole European economic strategy. So let me now problem at a very high cost. That's one side of the story. There's the other side of the story. Could the European banking system, financial system, withstand immediately the shock of a sovereign default? The view taken by Mr. Trichet, for example, is very clear. He thought, no. So he blocked, but he was not the only one. Now, for example, the IMF says that one could have restructured Greek debt much earlier and save us some of the problem. Trichet was adamant, and Trichet was not only adamant vis-à-vis Greece, he was also adamant vis-à-vis Ireland. And what happened in Ireland is, I think, not only interesting, but I might use even a strong term, a scandal. Because basically, the Irish were forced by European institutions, and especially by the European Central Bank, to bail not only the depositors, but all the creditors of Irish banks, and translate that into a debt burden for the Irish taxpayers. All right? So the Irish government was literally forced by European institutions to save not only the depositors of its banks, but its creditors as well. And many of the creditors were in other European countries. So it was an interesting decision that you force a government to accept the burden of its private banks and put it on the shoulders of its taxpayers. Now, another interesting question is austerity and reform. Austerity and reform are the two main pillars of the economic strategy adopted during the crisis, very much with a very strong German influence. Two or three, again, observations. One, what I mentioned before, I will repeat, is that if fiscal contraction is imposed on countries, even on countries where the source of the problem is not fiscal laxity. As I said before, the Irish are not suffering in the crisis because they had been lax with their fiscal policy. But you impose a fiscal austerity and fiscal contraction, and why do they have now big deficits? They have big deficits because they're being forced to save their banks, not for other reasons. Right? That's number one. So in a sense, you pretend that all countries are like Greece. So Greece provides the model for the strategy to apply to other countries as well. Second, you might say that if you impose fiscal contraction on several countries simultaneously, while the private sector is deleveraging after a bubble has burst, you are likely to end up with a vicious circle of austerity and recession, which is precisely what you have done. And it is also true, I mean, now the IMF comes afterwards and recognizes that its so-called fiscal multipliers, it got it wrong. So it was expecting a much smaller effect of fiscal contraction on GDP than you actually got. With the benefit of hindsight, we can say that. But there is another interesting question. For those of us who say that, it was too much to ask the Germans, the Irish, the Spaniards, the Portuguese to contract, and this has exacerbated the effect of the crisis. The implicit assumption, or what is implicit in the argument, is that if we would like them to contract less fast, somebody would have to provide the money. The markets would not provide the money. Therefore, what it therefore implies is that the Germans and others should have paid more money to the periphery to enable it to have a slower process of adjustment. So at least we should be aware of or understand what exactly we are asking the others to do. A slower pace of fiscal contraction in the periphery meant that the Germans would have to fork more money out of their pockets to give to the Greeks, to the Irish, to the Spaniards and the Portuguese. The politics, the way it developed in Germany, was not exactly easy for such a thing. The other question or issue to raise is, what is the sequencing of what you are asking those governments to do? You are asking those governments not only to contract fiscally, and remember that the Greek government reduced, and has in fact reduced, its fiscal deficit from 15.5% to 1.5% to 2% in a 3-year period, which is a record. And on top of that, you are asking the government to introduce a wide range of structural reforms. Remember, structural reforms, we can discuss the benefits or the good or bad things of those structural reforms, but structural reforms usually have one characteristic among other things, and this is that the political cost is immediate and the economic benefit takes years to materialize, if it does. So you are asking governments to squeeze fiscally and at the same time to open fronts with all kinds of interest groups that will fight against reform. So you are either hoping that you have politicians who, can perform miracles, or you are simply looking for politicians to sacrifice on the altar of adjustment. And I think it's more the latter rather than the former. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay. And on top of that, you had the usual European cacophony, in the sense that while, for example, you were trying to help the Greeks to reduce the spreads for their government bonds, you started passing information around that the restructuring of sovereign debts may actually be a good thing. And then you are surprised when the spreads actually begin to increase again. So, I mean, the European orchestra is always cacophonic. There is a problem with the way it operates. And let me quote myself, referring to Greece. There was anybody who has even the slightest sense of economic reality knew that when the crisis struck, a country like Greece had a long and very painful adjustment ahead of it. Other countries as well, but the Greek one was even bigger. The experience suggests that the adjustment has been much longer and much more painful, not only than anticipated, but also than necessary. And why is that? And this is my former economist attitude of on the one hand, on the other hand. What I did write once was the adjustment in Greece proved to be much longer and much more painful because of the inertia in the ineptitude of much of Greece's ruling class hit against the incoherence of European governance and the fundamentalism of the high priests of economic orthodoxy, in full view from the madhouse of international financial markets. What a world. Now, let us see the results. This is the impact of the long recession on real GDP in individual European countries. Well, the Greeks are the champions. They lost during that period 23.7% of their real GDP. But, you know, the periphery has not done marvelously. By Greek standards, has done marvelously. By any other standards, you know, the Irish have lost almost 8%, the Italians almost 9%, the Portuguese almost 7%, and the Spanish almost 6%. The Euro area average is negative, which means that our hope is that at best, real GDP of 2007 is going to be recovered by the end of 2015 for the Euro area as a whole.
It's Poland, that's amazing.
Yeah, I put there Poland to show the contrast. I put the United Kingdom because it's important and because I'm here. And also EU 27 to show that EU 27 did not do much better in comparison to the Euro area. So, pretty disastrous. And you can go to the next one and look at what happened to unemployment rates. The red bar is for unemployment in 2007, and the blue one is unemployment rate in 2013. Well, the Greeks and the Spaniards have hit record, but you know, the Portuguese with almost 17%, they are not doing marvelously. Italy is much lower, and Ireland is much lower. Now Ireland has been catching up fast, so the unemployment rate has been going down. And there's another interesting graph, and I will finish with graphs. And this is what happened to public debt as a percentage of GDP. So we've gone through a process of very long and painful adjustment. GDP suffered, unemployment suffered, everybody suffered. Where are we in terms of GDP as a percentage, or of public debt as a percentage of GDP? Well, the Greek debt started with 130, and it is now close to 180% of GDP, so this is not a great success. Irish, Spanish, Portuguese debts went up, but public debt in the whole of the euro area has gone up during the crisis. Now that's the end of my figures, so let me now end up with a few general comments. I think as far as Greece is concerned, and I will concentrate a bit on Greece, its debtors and the Troika that was asked to implement the adjustment program was asking Greek governments really the impossible. Asking a country to contract fiscally by something like 14, 15 percentage points in 3 years, and on top of it, open fronts with virtually everybody who is organized in the country, is basically asking the government to commit suicide. And this is precisely what has happened. The political system has imploded. Give you an illustration of what I mean by implosion. The two traditional parties in power, New Democracy and PASOK, most elections from 74 onwards, not from 81 onwards, represented anything between 75 to 85% of the vote combined. They alternated in power. Today, according to opinion polls, they represent at best 25 to 30%. So they lost almost 50% of the vote. Well, I mean, half of the electorate in a period of 5 years, 4 years. This is political implosion. Now, will they be missed? The answer to that question depends on who comes after them. Okay. Because as far as I'm concerned, most of them will not be missed. I mean, Greece has a corrupt clientele system that has been running the country, has been getting worse over the years. So the crisis has revealed not only fiscal mismanagement, not only growing lack of competitiveness, but it has revealed a dysfunctional political system. The problem is that when the system implodes under such conditions of crisis, it is not necessarily the case that those who will succeed them will be better than the previous ones. And the situation in Greece, and to some extent, to a lesser extent, in other countries of the European South, reminds me of the famous saying of Antonio Gramsci that there are some periods in human history when the old is dying and the new has not yet been born. In the intervening period, there is a big danger of monsters. And we're seeing many monsters in the European South. And perhaps to conclude, I think I will stop there. Okay, economic and political prospects, 2 words. This is where we are today. Where we are today is that we have a whole European South that has suffered in different degrees a very heavy price for largely mismanaged economies, but also largely as a result of the systemic crisis of the euro area. But also countries that have experienced a big earthquake politically, because it's not only in Greece. Remember that according to all recent opinion polls, Syriza, which is a radical left party, I'm not necessarily referring to them as monsters, don't misunderstand me. But Syriza, which is a radical left-wing party, is now ahead in all opinion polls by anything between 3 to 10 percentage points. Podemos, another pretty radical left-wing party, is ahead of opinion polls in Spain, and Sinn Féin is ahead in opinion polls in the Republic of Ireland. So even politically, that doesn't look like success, to put it mildly. And what are the prospects? And that's the last word. Ireland and Spain, economic growth has been picking up a bit, but it's still fragile. I think, or I fear, that if economic recession continues for much or little longer, there is a very serious risk of countries exploding rather than imploding. And of course, Greece would be a good candidate, but Greece may not be the only one. So this is what I meant in the beginning when I said that for some people, Greece, they suspect, may be leading the way to hell. Thank you.
Thank you, Loukas. Perhaps can you specify what you mean by exploding, and does it involve exit from the euro, for instance, and therefore
Yes,
creating the ripple effect?
Yeah,
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that would be part of the explosion. It's interesting that in all countries of the European periphery, in the same way that in all countries of the euro area, there is still a large majority in favor of the euro. And my explanation is simply fear of the alternative. They are not happy with what they have, but they are terrified of what they may get if they leave the euro. And there have been all sorts of a few scenarios of what an exit from the euro area may imply. But my fear is that if the recession lasts for much or little longer, I don't know, because you never know when things tick. One or more countries may decide that sudden death is better than slow strangulation. And that's where we are.
Okay, I'm going to open up to questions and comments. And I'll throw in my own at some point. Chris. And please introduce yourself for everyone.
Chris also, Institute for Energy Studies and Newcastle. Very, very interesting. But can we go back to your title, whodunnit? And there it seems, I think, the answer is fairly clear. Some certain kinds of ideas which are not exclusively demonic, but what have you. But you didn't say much about the other thing that happens in Cluedo, which is you've got to decide what instrument did it, or at least it's a clue. I just want to hear your views on that, because if I read you correctly, it was fiscal policy and fiscal framework was the instrument that was to blame.
No, there's some monetary policy as well, of course. There's monetary policy as well, of course. But
the monetary policy has been very loose.
Well,
Sorry, do you want to...
Yes, sorry, finish and now, please.
So your question is what instrument, what exactly elements of the policy is to blame?
Ah, okay.
Is that...
Yeah, what did this canoe use to do the deficit?
Yeah.
And did they do it by mistake?
Okay. I think, first of all, you're absolutely right to remind me that it's not only fiscal policy. And I concentrated on fiscal policy partly. I forgot to talk about monetary policy. Now, the ECB has done more than anybody else in saving the euro so far. We know that. And especially what Draghi did in 2012, which is interesting. He did it without spending any money, just by making a statement. We'll do whatever it takes. And the markets, because they are efficient and rational, behaved accordingly. So they believed the president of the European Central Bank, who says that he will do whatever it takes to save the euro. But compared to what happened, I think, but you know this much better than I do, so I don't know whether you will agree, compared to what the Bank of England did and what the Federal Reserve did in the United States, the loosening of monetary policy in the euro area has not been enough and has usually been too late. But there is a particular problem with the countries concerned. And this is that because, especially up to 2012, because of the risk of exit, there's been a fragmentation of the euro area in monetary terms. So the interest rates you had in Italy, in Greece, and in Spain were much higher than the interest rates. So companies were offered different interest rates on the basis of nationality, nothing else, because of the country risk. So that added to the problem. And there's a further one, and there was monetary strangulation in those countries because their banks were totally unable to lend. So you are squeezed fiscally, but you're also squeezed through the monetary side. And that's killing. I mean, in Greece, until last year, you had, and to give you an illustration, if there are a few, not many, Greek multinationals, I mean companies that have operations and production in several countries, including the United States. Even the best Greek company could borrow, and they began to borrow in 2012 and 13, before it was impossible, with 8% interest rate. Now, how do you compete in the euro area when you borrow at 8% of interest rate, and you are the best company of the country? The others simply have no access to money at all. So the recession, or rather the depression that we have experienced, is not only due to fiscal contraction, but it is also due to the monetary conditions prevailing because of the crisis in the euro area.
Can I have a supplement? I mean, the Draghi intervention that you referred to was actually trying to get exchange rate risk out. And we talk about the huge high interest rates and the periphery before that.
That's right, precisely.
And you could do a sum, say for Italy, which has had its debt ratio more or less where it is for a very long time, but if you take interest rates from about 0 in real terms to about 8, as you suggest, then it's not liquidity, it becomes solvency.
Yeah.
But you could argue that actually the ECB at least has been quite good at getting rid of that risk. And you referred many times to the idea that the euro itself is no longer regarded as being at risk, and that is strong with a lot of...
Did I say anything that the euro is not at risk?
What?
Did I say that the euro is not at risk?
No, you said that most people in the Eurozone accept that the Eurozone will keep growing. It's certainly gone out of markets.
True.
And the interest rates have gone down. So that would look like an instrument which was initially unintentional, but to which there was, if you like, a response.
Yeah.
But the austerity is as heavy as ever.
No, you're right. I would agree.
It hasn't created the room of maneuver for more in the fiscal policy side to allow the kind of sequencing with structural reform. So if really that monetary policy from the ECB had worked as we would want, it would have allowed to loosen a bit on the budget side.
Well, Draghi probably did his best under the circumstances, the political circumstances, because he has to fight against all kinds of established ideas about how monetary policy should be run, especially in a country like Germany. So I think he has done his best. So monetary policy has been better than fiscal policy, but if you compare to the United States, the European Central Bank has not done that much, facing a very big and prolonged recession.
Right, Trevelyan. There's many hands. So
I'm really curious to know why Greece became the model to repress crisis in Portugal, Spain, and Ireland, despite the fact that we have, as you showed us, we have different indicators of different problems. Was this because of some kind of lack of information, because of ideological or political constraints?
Well, all the other countries increased their budget deficits after the crisis struck because they had to deal with the crisis. They also had to save their banks. Right? So the fiscal laxity is a consequence of the crisis, not a cause of the crisis in those countries. Why did the Germans insist on that? Is it dogmatism or is it something else? I'm not absolutely sure. There's certainly this idea about debt. You see, the German argument, what is it? That debt is behind the crisis. Right? You're talking about the bursting of the bubble. The bubble is the result of accumulated large debts. So you have to deal with the source of the problem. But the way we've dealt, irrespective of whether they were right in their analysis or wrong, what happened is that today debt is bigger than it was in 2009 in virtually every European country, if you take private and public debt together. And there are countries where private debt is much higher than the debt you will find in the periphery. Take, for example, the Netherlands. And not only. Private debt as a percentage of GDP is significantly higher than you will find in the European South. So, I mean, in fact, Wolfgang Streeck is arguing that the borrowed time concept applies to the whole of Europe and the whole of the West.
Please introduce yourself.
Loukas, there's one set of graphs that haven't appeared, and it's very much in our press at the moment, and that is the whole question of taxation, avoidance, and evasion. As a non-economist, I have the perception that it has escalated in the last 10 years or so because of new financial instruments that are possible. But have countries varied very much on this graph, and isn't that a central part of the deficit austerity problem in all our countries? It's certainly being felt here.
Well, I mean, because of free capital movements and the liberalization of financial markets, at least for the big guys and the big multinationals, tax avoidance has been made easier. And now in the process, this is one of the good things of the crisis, we are discovering all kinds of skeletons coming out from cupboards. I mean, we suspected, but perhaps we didn't know the scale of what has been happening in Luxembourg with multinational companies, or what has been happening to a larger, to a smaller extent in the Republic of Ireland. So this is essentially free riding. In a free market, this is free riding, because you are trying to attract customers by offering them a lower, not only a lower tax rate, but essentially a close to zero tax rate in an open market. In the periphery, much of the fiscal contraction, most of the fiscal consolidation has been done through cutting expenditure rather than raising taxes, partly also because, you know, if the economy is shrinking, it's very difficult to increase your total tax receipts. In a country like Greece, which is, has a long history of tax avoidance and tax evasion, it is not only because, well, it has to do something with values and culture, of course, but it also has to do with economic structure. Greece has the highest percentage of self-employed people in the OECD. Now, it is known it's much more difficult to tax self-employed than to tax large companies unless they are registered in the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg.
Awesome.
Loukas, let me first add my thanks to Calypso. It's great for what you're here, and as usual, you've been so clear in those difficult concepts, and I appreciate also your bitter sense of humor in this sad situation. It's interesting what you said about Germany treating all the other countries like Greece. Perhaps, if I may add, maybe it was treating all the other countries like East Germany, and kind of...
Except not giving them as much money as
politicians. And we discovered also that it has a significant share of politicians who played together with the banking system, enabling a few bankers to essentially bankrupt the country. So the responsibility collectively of those who ran Ireland before the crisis is big. But Ireland has a much more flexible and dynamic and robust economy than Greece. A much more extrovert economy with multinationals that operating in the whole of the European market. Greece doesn't. Ireland also has a much more efficient bureaucracy than Greece does. One of the things that many of our European friends discovered painfully was that Greece had the standards of living of a very developed country. Remember that according to the United Nations Living Conditions Indicators, before the crisis, Greece was among the 25 top countries in the world. And it's still not very far below that. But Greece has always had a bureaucracy that reminds you, or a state that reminds you more of the Balkans and the Middle East than of Western Europe. Now, this was revealed to the eyes of many Europeans after the crisis, because they had to deal with Greece as a country receiving assistance and being under supervision. So that is another explanation. Now, whether Ireland is on a steady course to recovery, I don't know, it largely depends also what happens to the European economy. If the European economy goes for the third dip, who will the Irish be exporting to? To Singapore. So it's a collective problem. If we stagnate in the whole of Europe, it's going to be very difficult for the Irish or even the Germans to continue growing. And look, the German economy is not doing wonderfully, to put it mildly, but it has a very low rate of unemployment. A very low rate of unemployment and an increasing number of low-paid precarious jobs. To be fair and to complete the picture, the Schröder reform, to a considerable extent, had that effect. It helped to reduce unemployment, but it also made Germany a more unequal society. So, which is a very serious dilemma, especially if you are on the left of the center of the political spectrum. How do you deal with it? If I may add one last word, if there is a trade-off between competitiveness and internal social cohesion, that is a very difficult trade-off for people on the left to deal with, if they are realistic.
Especially since the whole ordo-liberal ideology, and followed by the great alliance in Germany between the two sides of the political spectrum, was exactly that there shouldn't be a trade-off, that social harmony was that which would underpin German competitiveness and all of that. So that
there
was,
as well, New Labour.
And the third way too. So there was always been trying to kind of square that circle. And what you're saying and what we're seeing is that indeed this logic has kind of been broken, as it were.
Well, if you look at all the figures on inequalities, they suggest that it was not like that.
Right. Second.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you think there's a close parallel to be drawn between the imposition of fiscal contraction on Greece and the imposition of reparations on Germany after World War I. Yeah, and especially if you consider that the latter led to the rise of the Nazi Party, the former led to the rise of the Neo-Nazi Party.
Yeah, it's not a comparison I like to make. Greece was clearly insolvent, okay? And the fact that you have prolonged this, because even the restructuring that took place later in 2011-12 was a very partial restructuring, and most of it affected the Greek banks, because in the intervening period, most of the creditors to Greece of sovereign debt, foreign banks got out. And it was only the Greek banks that were left with Greek government bonds. So when you restructured the debt, a large part of the money you gained, you had to pay to save the banks that became bankrupt because you restructured the debt. So it becomes a vicious circle. But Greece was not only bankrupt or insolvent, but also required major reforms. And the problem with Greece today, I think, and that's something I did not mention earlier, is that in terms of fiscal consolidation, the performance is spectacular with the cost. But it's been a dramatic progress. Now Greece is running a primary surplus in its budget. It's the second year. Not bad for a country starting from 15.5% deficit. But there's been slow progress in terms of the overall reform in the country, and especially the reform of the state. The judiciary, state bureaucracy, health, and so on and so forth. Is it because you were asking a government to do so much and it couldn't do it? Or is it because that kind of reform is a direct attack on the clientele system on which the present political parties rely? I don't have an answer. But probably
the
both.
question had the additional dimension of German reparations, right?
Yeah, so reparations were imposed in Germany when we did the 40s.
Post-World War One.
Yeah, post-World War One,
Yeah.
which led to the rising mass party.
So
Fiscal contraction.
does it look
Yeah.
like that too?
Well, what happened is that you have a neo-Nazi party in Greece, which really nobody expected, which is getting anything between 7 and 12% of the vote, or in opinion polls. And you have a radical left party that started as a fringe group with 3 or 4%, now going to come to power. What is going to be the sequence after that, I don't know, but it may not be very happy.
David.
My name is David Madden. Lucas and I used to run the ERA conferences in Greece together. A very happy period of my life. Lucas, I have a sort of broader question and also a comment. And the broader question is about opinion polls. Because when you were sort of looking at the monsters describing the landscape, and you're relying on opinion polls, it is a broad question. I just wonder how much reliance we can put on opinion polls these days. With the flood of information, social media, and everyone having opinions about anything and everything as far as I can see. The late opinion polls in the Scottish referendum seem to go wrong because they were sort of riding a bubble of opinion. If you look at opinion polls now in the United Kingdom, you have not the faintest idea what is going to happen in the general election next year. So, you're an expert. How much reliance can we put on opinion polls these days? The comment is, you said that only Greek banks were left with Greek government bonds.
Well, not only.
Banks were left
Yeah.
not least because they were continuing buying till the last minute. Anyway, what about opinion polls? What do you think?
No, you're right, but even if you discount many things from what the results you get in opinion polls, they show a trend. I think there is little doubt that, for example, in Greece, Syriza is ahead. Now, I don't know whether it's going to be, if there's an election tomorrow in Spain, whether Podemos is going to be the first party. But having started from zero and now being top of the polls, even if you discount, still the trend is pretty clear. If Sinn Féin keeps appearing first in public opinion polls in the Republic of Ireland, this is also indicative. It may not be the first party in the election, but I think it would be much more sizable in the parliament than it has ever been in its history. And that is something. That's all I can say. I mean, I'm not suggesting that necessarily in 2 years' time the European periphery will be run by radical left-wing parties. Some countries may.
Progress.
I want to ask you a little bit about the future, as you see it. And I don't know if there are simulations, studies. What happens if the euro breaks up? And what happens if one of those parties take over and say unilateral withdrawal from the euro, or haircut? There are so many options, possibilities. Realistically, can it happen? How would it happen if one member of the euro says enough is enough, we're out? Or indeed, if a number of them say, let's negotiate a peaceful breakup. Has it ever been on the cards? You need to consider how this might work.
Well, it has been on the cards. Not so much an overall breakup of the euro, but individual country exits, and more particularly Greek exit. The Greek exit was on the cards clearly until the election in Greece in 2012. I am told that before the elections, Mrs. Merkel was leaning towards a Grexit. And then when it was studied further, the German government decided that the risk would be too much, not for Greece, but for the euro area as a whole. And then Samaras came to power, and that added further to the decision to keep Greece inside. There have been a number of economic studies that tried to predict, develop a scenario of how this could happen. Of course, it depends whether it is organized, disorganized, and so on. But nobody really knows, because before, in previous exchange rate arrangements, you still had your currency. Right? So you basically broke from a fixed exchange rate regime and you devalued or revalued. Now you have to create a currency, which means that you have to close banks and the system for at least a few days if you are fast and quick in printing a new currency. Now suppose that have a country like Greece that breaks out tomorrow. That will immediately lead to a big devaluation of the drachma, right? Because there will be panic. Now a huge devaluation of the drachma will lead to high inflation. There will be many bankruptcies in the country. And many of those bankruptcies will also create litigations with foreign countries. Because you are in a system where...
Domestic laws will be converted, but...
Yeah, so suddenly, if you have a debt of 1 million euros, and suddenly the debt becomes 1,500,000, the equivalent in drachmas, you have a problem, or many companies will have a problem. So several countries will go bankrupt, several companies will go bankrupt. Banks may go bankrupt as well. But beyond that, it's very difficult to predict. If you have a breakup of the euro area, Germany will suffer significantly because the Deutschmark, the new Deutschmark, will go through the roof. I have sympathy and understanding for many of the German reactions and criticisms of Germany's partners and the way the Greeks have behaved. The way Greeks have behaved before the crisis was very irresponsible.
Okay? The Greek leaders?
The Greek leaders, yeah, but voted by the Greek society, unfortunately. And if you want to put it further, those who asked a change of course were never voted by the Greek society. Okay, so let us be honest. So, my criticism to Germany would go as follows. First of all, Mrs. Merkel never explained to the German public clearly that it was not only a question of Greek sin or Irish sin, which there was, but there was also a systemic problem of the euro area, for which Germany bears some responsibility. Second, that the German banks were heavily involved in the whole thing. So it was not like, there was no German involved in the operation. There were many Germans involved in the operation. And number three, Germany is probably the country that benefits the most from the euro. And therefore, if you benefit the most from the euro, you may have to make some sacrifices. But if you do that and you make it clear, then it is easier to ask from your electors support. But if you only present it in terms of sinners, and you have built having, cartoons of those sinners and how they behave, then it becomes very difficult.
Indeed.
So she lost the public opinion. She allowed the public opinion to develop in such a way that it then became a constraint on policy. And that would be my criticism.
Not only has Germany benefited from the euro, but also from the crisis itself, with negative interest rates and all the rest of it. And one question that I've had for a long, long time is whether this has been costed. So to ask Merkel to say this to her public opinion, it would be nice to have some sort of semi-consensus on some figures. The overall figure of how Germany's benefited the most from the Eurozone since '99. But secondly, and that's a different figure from the crisis, you think, Fabulous, you cite some things. Yeah, you allude to it in your piece from not the foreign affairs piece, but the other piece you wrote. You allude to that, I think.
There's a Bertelsmann survey published a year or two ago.
Yeah, we need to wrap our head around those figures. Absolutely. Irini.
Irene Karamos, I'm a little bit here. I was wondering, you said, and I completely agree that there was the public deficit, the credibility deficit. And I was wondering, in your discussions and giving these talks, and has that been restored now? Because this seems to be, and that would be probably new democracies and the government's carrying argument, I'm focusing on Greece, as to the fact that there's now a much more sincere, concrete relationship than there would be with any other succeeding. Has that been rectified, or is that still
it has been improved, but only partially. Greek statistics are no longer Greek statistics, so they're reliable. Number one. Number two, successive Greek governments in the last 3 or 4 years have delivered quite a bit in terms of fiscal consolidation and even some reform. What is one big problem with Greece, unlike, for example, Ireland or even Portugal, is that there has not been until now a Greek narrative of reform. Reform is imposed from outside, so the Troika comes and tells you what are the things you need to do, and you say, oh horror, we don't want to do that, and we're going to negotiate and see how many concessions we make. There is no proper Greek narrative of reform, and that is a very serious issue, or mission, and that is something that is realized by other countries, and therefore the credibility is not as good as it should have been, and rightly so.
So in the back there, did you?
Just come back quickly. Isn't that a common feature of European countries, that whenever there is a painful reform you need to push through, it's always the European Union that is the...
Well, the Irish didn't play that game so much, and I don't think even the Portuguese played that game so much. The Greeks did.
Yeah. No, just the lady there, and then you. If you can introduce just say your name.
I'm Louise, I'm an MSc student in the same. So you mentioned at the beginning there's evidence to talk about crisis in Cyprus. I'm just wondering whether you can just share your views on what was the causes there, and just tell us anything about Cyprus.
Okay. I mean, very briefly, the large part of the problem in Cyprus is because Cypriot banks sat on much Greek government debt. So when the debt went through a severe haircut, they lost much of their capital. So Greece is largely responsible, not entirely, for the bankruptcy of Cyprus through its banks. Sorry. But there is also the fact that the previous president and his administration refused to recognize the problem for long, refused to make a decision how to deal with it because they basically decided it was much better to present that as a gift to the successor. and the successor seemed to be unprepared, and we had the scenes, very unpleasant scenes, we had in Brussels, including tears and all the rest. But Cyprus has shown much more sobriety once the decision was taken to deal with the problem than the Greeks did.
Sorry, can you speak louder?
I was wondering to what extent do you think that Juncker's 300 billion investment program could be the precursor to some sort of fiscal union, given that it's actually going to be funded by mainly private money through project bonds, and whether this kind of plan should be delayed in the case that it can also delay any deep reform or willingness to get to grips with the secretary process.
Well, many of us, those of us who criticize the current economic strategy of the European Union, have been arguing in favor of measures to boost demand. Okay? And politically, it seems to be easier to boost demand through the European Union rather than through national budgets, because the Germans will not budge. Rightly or wrongly, but I mean, we can't force the Germans to spend more money and increase the deficit in Germany. So the Juncker idea is, on the surface, I think a right one. And 300 billion is not an insignificant sum of money, even if it is for the whole of the European Union. The trouble is, what I understand, is that nobody really knows, probably not even Mr. Juncker, where this money is going to come from. So this is a general idea, but there's not yet enough flesh in it. So when I see the flesh, I'll tell you.
The EIB?
Yeah, but you know, we have to think it more carefully.
David, you're going to have to jump in. But we, okay.
From the Italian, David Hine question, PPIL. I mean, from the Italian perspective, it doesn't look quite like it does elsewhere. First observation I would say is Syriza, Podemos, Sinn Féin, what the hell are they going to do that's different? They're not going to do anything that's different. They may look crazy at the moment, but they'll get into power and they'll be constrained in exactly the same way as other politicians. Now, maybe the explosion is phased. But you actually got to have those sorts of messy governments. Then you have some kind of explosion, and then you begin to recompose it. And the Italians have been through that.
With Cinque Stelle.
With Cinque Stelle already. And they've seen, I mean, it seems to me that there's a beginnings of a narrative of understanding of the nature of the crisis in Italy, which is mildly encouraging. And while I don't suppose it's going to be easy to replicate in Greece, which looks like the worst country in terms of public understanding of these issues, for the reasons that we outlined in the last 2 or 3 questions. You know, what I would put in response to this rather gloomy and depressing discussion we've had, and it does look gloomy, and we haven't even begun to talk about the effects of deflation and a new mediocrity for even the German economy and others, which is dispiriting, is that there actually has to be an understanding of what it is to live with zero growth for a very long period of time. And I just begin to see the glimmers of something like that in the Italian context. Now, it's true that the story in each of the countries we've set out is different, and the Italian one is very different because they've been living with it for so much longer. And the real Italian problem goes back to the 80s, not to the euro. It was very unwise of them to join, but they did, and they got particularly screwed. But actually, I would have said that the Renzi performance and what is now happening in Italy is just a tiny glimmer of light that might then shine out elsewhere in terms of a new public understanding of what's got to be done. Unfortunately, as we discussed last night, Renzi hasn't done very much about it yet, and he's still, the jury's still very much out, but until the electorates of the countries we've been talking about do have some new understanding of it, which may come after these disastrous governments that we've just done,
but I think it might come at that point, then it's not going to happen.
My fear is that if the understanding comes after some more disaster is experienced, it may no longer be useful. Okay, but that's really my fear. And also, if it is true that we're going to go through a long period of zero growth or close to zero growth, with perhaps a bit of deflation or close to zero inflation, some countries or societies may not be able to take that. Things may be, yeah, but
very few explanations.
Yeah, this is true. This is true.
If we said this was what it was going to be like 20 years ago, we wouldn't have believed it.
You are absolutely right. But the fact that we are still alive is not a necessary indication that we will be alive after tomorrow.
I'm
After tomorrow.
It's nice that Greece can always be compared to Italy in that sense. Peter.
So hi, I'm Peter Viss. I'm the EU fellow, which means I'm on from the EU institutions, and I'm not an economist myself or climate change, but I've been really interested by this presentation because I have seen this crisis unfold from Brussels. So, to characterize this is, could we be looking at one country has an election that explodes and frightens everyone to such an extent that we decide, well, I'm sorry for them, I didn't want this to happen. I mean, there's no way. But is that a possible hypothesis?
It's not only a plausible hypothesis, but some people have thought of it. That, you create a bad example that scares everybody else.
In fact, Greece was spoken like that. At the Times 2 or 3 years ago, when Brexit was really in the top of the news, there was a sense that it's small enough that we can kind of experiment with Greece. I heard this so many times. Yeah, the euro could withstand a Greek exit. We'll learn from it. Too bad for Greece. I mean, there was a bit of that sense, I think. Not anymore. Isn't that right, Jonathan?
Well, I think so, and the sense that the Greeks got themselves into this anyway. So they're undeserving poor, if you will.
You mentioned about clientelism, corruption, issues of governance. How realistic is it to expect that the Commission in the next 5 years, or the Union as a whole, will focus on these issues? The dysfunctional domestic political system, the media, the judiciary, the rule of law. There are so many issues you can imagine. Ireland, in Portugal, in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in Cyprus. And the stories about the banks, I guess it happens here as well. I mean, one hears tales about British banks. So how realistic is it to expect that instead of speaking about ever closer union and grand federalist projects, the Commission and the Union as a whole start focusing on these domestic, real, serious, important issues? It'll be a change of tone, a very significant change, but is that realistic?
Can you not respond right now? Because what I want to do is take a last set of interventions, because there's suddenly hands that are coming up, and we are normally closing at 45. So. James.
So the question, I'm James Spaldry, economics tutor at Baylor. The question before last just put in my head with the issue of whether anyone's thought of the possibility that somebody might leave and make a success of it. The presumption that the only thing that can happen if somebody leaves is a disaster. I wouldn't be so sure. What I was thinking of, what I wanted to raise earlier on was, Loukas, at the beginning you you said that the problem was in some sense the plan to create a monetary union without having a nation state to go with it. But you didn't seem to make anything of that thought later on. And indeed, the emphasis, for example, that you're putting on the fact that it's not a fiscal problem, a governmental fiscal problem initially, except in Greece, rather points in the other direction, doesn't it? Because you can only have a successful monetary union if you have a nation-state story. It's usually go along with you need a fiscal union of some sort, but that's precisely not the problem. So it sounds like there would still have been a Spanish real estate bubble, there would still have been a burst, there'd still have been a burst in Ireland. Why is it that one would say that the problem here is the absence of a nation-state? It looks to me as if it's simply the presence of a monetary union.
Okay.
There we have it.
Let me write those things down because I will forget them.
So, do you want to have it? Francisco.
I don't know what to say because I'm
Sorry, introduce yourself.
Yeah, so Francisco Flores, I'm an academic visitor here. There are people that put the difference between fast incremental institutional change and slow cultural change. And what I see is that we have been through very fast incremental change in terms of institutions. Each day we create a new one. And obviously that has some positive aspects. Things are changing briefly, and we are building this banking union, and people are dealing with banks in a different way, and probably societies are adapting fast. On the other hand, it seems that we lost the notion of strategy, of new paradigms in Europe, because before the crisis, Europe had kind of a social model or a European model to show to the world to be a model of experiment globalization, and it's lost because of urgency. So basically we're doing nothing, we're all becoming very similar, with some improvement in the south, but Germany becoming a southern country. You said it started in Greece, then it went to Ireland, Portugal, Spain, but suddenly Italy, France, and I guess Finland and so on, and Germany is not doing much more. They are giving money to women to stay at home, or they're subsidizing coal or so. So it looks really a tragedy in terms of strategy for such a big country. So we lost a bit that notion. But is it that not that societies are changing? One thing I hear, for instance, by teaching Portuguese public servants is that, yes, austerity, what austerity? We're doing nothing here. This is all a game. We should do much more. We should go even further. There are many reforms to be done and don't cost necessarily money or impose immediate social costs. So I think people are learning through the process. And I'm foreign to know we are learning, but it's probably too late, and as you say, everything might implode or explode in the meantime, or in fact we are changing the way Europe or the European Union is going.
Okay, last 10 seconds, Jonathan.
Okay. Going back to your comment about the lack in Greece of a narrative for reform, I was struck by that because it sounded a bit like the issue in Romania. You contrasted Ireland, where they had that narrative for reform, so they internalised the reform. Where would you place the other southern states on that sort of scale between Ireland and Greece? Because I certainly agree with you that that is an important issue.
Okay, so, and now you have 30 seconds to address all these questions. Just a few minutes to bring it all together.
Very quickly. I don't believe that you can have domestic reform and modernization imposed by Brussels. And this is the experience we have learned through many years. I think much, if I may put it very bluntly, much of the literature on so-called Europeanization is, I've always thought, it's a lot of rubbish. So that's
succinct, and at least we understand what you think.
Number two, James. Well, I think we know from experience, James, what is needed for a currency union to function. And among other things that are needed are not only a fiscal union, but, for example, some kind of mutualization of risk. And that's precisely what the banking union is meant to do. Okay, but the problem of the Spanish banks or the Irish banks was more general. We never thought, nobody thought that financial markets needed much regulation or banks needed much regulation. We were told, I never believed that, but we were told, yeah, you know, the system is self-regulating because markets are efficient and rational. So what the hell do they need? Okay, so the problem in Spain or Ireland had much to do with a sort of ideologically loaded approach. That's one of the things I tried to do yesterday, is that the crisis of European integration and of the Union is part of a much bigger crisis that affects us both at the level above and below the EU level. It has to do with the growing number of losers and growing inequalities within our societies. It has to do with the growing disconnect between economics and politics. It has to do with the growing disconnect between elites and publics. And you have to dig deeper. So the European problem is almost an after effect. And finally, what was it? Oh, what's the scale?
Back to your admission at the beginning that you thought much harder about Greece than the other southern countries.
So that's the most difficult question to answer. I think that Renzi either claims or pretends to have a narrative, but we still have to wait and see whether this materializes into concrete policy. So, but Italy so far has been very much resistant to reform. The Irish are on the other end of the spectrum. The Spaniards have done better than the Greeks, and I think probably I know least about the Portuguese, so I won't be able to place them on the spectrum. Yeah. And I wouldn't like to put France anywhere there.
Thank God. Thank goodness we've left France and the UK out of this picture, because we've covered so much ground with you, Loukas. You've been so candid with us in your assessment of the whole landscape. You've given us some hints about the future. Perhaps there we would want to push you more if we were going to collectively write some sort of blueprint, but what to happen next. Although we know that you're a bit skeptical about what Juncker is really proposing to us. We hope, really, I hope that Greece's very tentative, very small fiscal progress will be translated economically. But I have to say, you didn't give us a lot of ground for hope in Greece. So that would be, I hope, the next talk you'll give to us in 2 or 3 years. You will be telling us how Greece is starting to produce stuff again and to sell them to the rest of Europe and all of that. But in awaiting this great moment and in thanking you very, very much, Loukas, for a wonderful conversation, I'd like to ask everyone to join me. Thank you.